Hello, welcome to TechPoint Fundamentals YouTube channel. In this video today we will see what is default constructor in C Sharp, or we also say this default constructor as a parameterless constructor or instance constructor. So let's start the video. Before continuing this video, I have already created a nice article. If you go to my website, here I have created a simple nice article for constructor. Here you can read about all the constructor like default constructor, static constructor, private constructor and copy constructor. So you can read it out from here in detail. So in this video we will only focus on default constructor. So default constructor is nothing but a constructor without any parameter, and a constructor is a special member function of a class which has the same name as the class but without any return type. So let's simply create a class user, and in this class let's make it public, and in this class let's create an default constructor. Constructor has the same name as class. If you see, this class name is user, so the constructor name will also be the user. And in this constructor, let's say I want to just print a simple message, console.write line, and in this message user class default constructor, right? So this is the simple default constructor, and each and every class has implicit default constructor. If user is not creating any explicit default constructor, in that case there is implicit default constructor for each and every class. But if user has defined any constructor, whether it is parameterized or default constructor, in that case the default system defined default constructor will never invoke. So you cannot return any value from a constructor, but if you try to return any value like return 0, and since constructor cannot return any value, you cannot specify any return type for any constructor, right? If you see, it will generate an error: user member name cannot be same as their including type. Including type means this user, right? So because you cannot specify any return type, so you cannot return any value, but you can have return statement like this, right? It is valid. You can specify this return statement here, and but you cannot return any value specifically in case of struct. Let's create an object for this class so that we can see the output. New user dot, and let's create an object name as well, where is new user. And if you run this program, user class default constructor, right? This constructor is invoked. So there is a question, can you return a value from a constructor? You cannot return any value by providing the return keyword with a value, but yes, you can have return statement without any value. So if you want to return a value from a constructor, in that case you can use per uh, out or ref parameters. So we will see about those parameters in case of parameterized constructor, but for now you cannot return any value. But if there is a requirement to get any value from the constructor, in that case you can use a ref or a default referent parameter. So can you throw an exception from a constructor? Yes, you can throw any exception from the constructor. So suppose here I want to throw an exception, throw divide by 0 exception, and it is perfectly valid. You can return any statement. Remove this return keyword, and if you run this program, first the user class default constructor message is printed, and after that, since we have thrown an exception explicitly, so that's it is showing the exception as it is. So yes, you can throw a exception explicitly from the constructor, whether it is default constructor or parameterized constructor or any static constructor. If every class has a implicit default constructor, then why explicit default constructor required? So that's very interesting question. For demonstrating that question, let me create another class. If you are not defining any constructor, in that case the default constructor invoked automatically. Let's create a base class, public class base class, and in this class there is no constructor at all, and I want to inherit that class into this user class. Now this is valid, right? If you run this program, it is working perfectly. And let's create an constructor here as well. Public base class, and similarly this message, we want to display this constructor message from this base class as well. Now if you run this program, base class default constructor is executed first, then user class default constructor. Now if you make this constructor as parameterized, string name, and in this case, since I have defined a parameterized constructor in this base class, the default constructor will never be invoked. It means if you see here, it is providing me a error. There is no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter name of the base class. So because this base class has only a parameterized constructor, that's why you have to provide the value for this name parameter of this base class constructor. Otherwise you cannot inherit this class into this user class. If you remove this constructor at all, in that case you will get an error saying that there is no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter name. So in that case, if you want to inherit this base class into this user class, you have to define a constructor, and with that constructor you have to pass the value for this base class constructor. Otherwise you cannot inherit this and you will always get a compile time error. So this is the reason, if user if every class have an implicit default constructor, then why explicit default constructor required? So suppose we don't want that user have to pass, because if a class has a lot of constructor, in that case sometimes it is not necessary that user has to provide, the derived class have to provide the parameters to the base class. So in that case, since this base class don't have any default constructor explicitly, so you can have a default constructor. Suppose first let me copy that, and we will remove this constructor from here, and the base class default constructor, and this will be a non-default or parameterize, right? And now if you see, the user class is not providing any compile time error because there is a default constructor in this base class and it is perfectly valid. So you can have a default constructor to initialize the member fields or variables of a class internally, because if system defined default constructor is invoked, in that case it assigns the default value to each and every members or fields or property to the default one. If you run this program, base class default constructor is called, then user class default constructor is called. And if you want to call this parameterized constructor, then you have to pass this value name. So let me pass the value, and you have to use this base keyword and take point, right? And if remove this default constructor from this base class, now it is perfectly valid, right? If you run this program, base class constructor, if you see the message base class constructor, then the user class default constructor. So in this way, if the derived class have any constructor, then you have to pass this parameter to this base class constructor, otherwise you will get a compile time error. If a class has defined an explicit constructor, in that case the implicit or system defined constructor will be invoked or no. So in that case, as we see in this example, if user has defined any constructor, whether it is a default or parameterized, in that case the system defined default constructor is never invoked. So basically the default constructor are only invoked if when there is no constructor defined by the user in any class. And there are always two types of default constructor, that is implicit, which is system defined, and explicit, which is user defined. We also sometimes called it instance constructor, because it is a non-static constructor, right? And can a class be inherited which have no default constructor in C#? If a class, base class have no constructor, no default constructor, in that case it can be inherited in the derived class, but the derived class must have to pass the parameter to the base class parameterized constructor, otherwise you cannot inherit that base class. So it is responsibility of the derived class to pass the parameter to the base class parameterized constructor. Like this, you have to use this base keyword, and after this you have to provide the uh, parameters to the base class constructor. Suppose there is one more parameter like integer id, and in this case if you see, this base keyword is generating an error because it requires one more parameter for this default parameterized constructor of the base class, that will suppose that 120. Now it is perfectly working now, right? Can a class be inherited which have no default constructor in C sharp? Yes, but if the class has a parameterized constructor, in that case you have to pass the parameters for the base class parameterized constructors, right? When you create the variable or object of a class without the new keyword, in that case the constructor invoked or not in C sharp. So suppose what I want, let's remove this line from here, and just create a variable of user type. If you use this one, this user, in that case the constructor of this user class will be invoked or not. If you are just creating the variable of class type without using the new keyword, in that case constructor will never invoked. And since you can also assign equal to null in this case also, for any constructor to be invoked the object must be created using the new keyword, because this new keyword is responsible for creating the memory and allocating the corresponding uh, values for that particular member, whether it is a primitive type or any reference type. So these all the things will happen only we create the object of a class with the new keyword. Now if you want to assign any value to this user class, then you can do, suppose where user is equal to new user, and if you create this, you can also set this user is equal to user, right? Since you have assigned this value into this user, so here if you created the object using this new keyword, in that case the constructor will be invoked. But whenever you assign this user variable to this underscore user, in that case also the constructor will never execute it. This is invoked when this user object is created using this new keyword, base class constructor and user class default constructor. In which order the constructor are executed in case of inheritance? In case of inheritance, the base class constructors executed first, then the derived class. But just for remember one more thing here, in case of destructor, the derived class destructors are always called first before the base class destructor. But in case of constructor, the base class constructor are always executed first, then the derived class constructors. When you create the variable or object of a class without the new keyword, in that case the constructor invoked or not? No, the constructor will never invoke if you are creating any object or variable of a class without new keyword. Can you call a constructor explicitly in C sharp? No, you cannot call any constructor explicitly by writing any code. If you see, let me create a simple variable and prop public string name is equal to tech, right? And if you press dot here, you will see this name property to execute or use, but you will never get this intelligence for this user constructor at all. So you cannot call the constructor explicitly. The last question, can a structure or interface have default constructor in C sharp? So with the introduction of C sharp 8, interface can also have default methods and also abstract method, virtual method, partial method. All types of method you can define in the interface, but still you cannot create any constructor in the interface. But in case of structure, you can have constructor, but you cannot define any default constructor explicitly. Let me see for that practical demo. Let me create a structure, user structure, and if public and let me write a simple message here, and if you see the error message, structs cannot contain explicit parameterless constructor. So you cannot define any explicit default constructor. The constructor must be parameterized if you are defining any constructor in the structure. But remember, you can only have parameterized constructor if it is static, because we know that static constructors are always parameterless. We'll see that when we discussed about this static constructor in my upcoming videos. So here you have to pass any variable, suppose name, right? And now if you create this structure object in the main, let's remove this all, and where is equal to new. But there is a interesting thing here. You can create object of this class, right, if you are not passing any parameter at all. And let's me create one more variable here, uh, not variable, method basically. Let's copy this method, like display method without any and return type will be void for this method. And let me create a variable of string type, string name, and we will print this name in this parameter. Then let's initialize this value, this dot name is equal to name. and this method we will display the name. Right now, if you want to print that message, user dot display name is null basically, because string is a reference type, and the default constructor of structure define the default values to this name. So it is valid for this user, which is object of this user struct. But in this case, let me do the same thing with this class. Let me remove this base class and this also, and let me create an object of this class after defining a parameterized constructor. Right now, remove this message, and this dot name is equal to name. Right, same method which we have used here, and we will be used here as well. And let's create an object of the same class, and let me remove this user, just user and user. If you see, there is no argument given that correspond to the required formal parameter name of user. If class has only parameterized constructor and no default constructor, in that case you cannot create any object of that class without passing the parameters to the constructor. But in case of structure, you have defined only parameterized constructor, but still you can create object of this structure type without passing any parameter to the constructor. So this is the difference between these two, because no matter when you are passing any parameter to this constructor or not, the default constructor will always there. So let's again pass this any name here, checkpoint fundamentals, similarly here as well. Right now, if you run this program, it is working perfectly. Struct constructor is called, then it prints the name. Similarly for this class as well, name and constructor. So summarizing what we have learned today, so there is always two types of default constructor. One is system defined default constructor and one is user defined default constructor. System defined constructor are only invoked when there is no user defined constructor in the class. If there is any user defined constructor in the class, in that case the default constructor will never invoke in case of class. But in case of structure, if user have defined any constructor, but the default constructor is always there. And you cannot return any value from the constructor, but you can have return statement without any value. You can also throw exception from the constructor, and if every class have a implicit default constructor, in that case we also use explicit default constructor, and this default constructor can be used to initialize the value for the class member variables and properties. because we know that the default constructor, system default constructor only initialize the properties with the default value. And one more good use of having explicit default constructor, that if there is a lot of constructor with different type of parameters, in that case you can define a simple default constructor which initialize the fields of the class. And in that case it will not be mandatory for the derived class to pass the parameters of the base class, because we know that there may be some conditions, some situations where uh, constructor are overloaded, and in that case the derived class have to define constructor. Suppose the base class has 5 constructor, then the derived class also have defined 5 constructor to pass the values to the base class constructor based on object which user is trying to create by passing the parameters of the constructor. Can a class be inherited which have no default constructor? Yes, a class can be inherited if it has no default constructor, but the derived class has to provide the value for the base class parameterized constructor. In case of inheritance, the base class constructors are always executed first, then child class. If you create a variable or object of a class without new keyword, in that case the constructors are never executed. We cannot call any constructor explicitly. And the last question, in case of structure you can have only parameterized constructor, you cannot define any parameterless default constructor, and a default constructor is always there in case of structure. So that's all for today. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you like this video, so please like this video. If you have any doubt, please do comment. I will respond to that question as well. And you can find out the link for this article in the description of this video. So please subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can get notification whenever I upload a new video to my YouTube channel. In the next video I will explain about what is parameterized constructor, and how we can overload a constructor, and what is constructor chaining. So thanks for watching this video.